Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mercedes Page, and I'm the CEO of Young Australians in International Affairs. I'm delighted to welcome you all to Asia Society's inaugural Generation Asia Youth Forum today. We've brought together 4 of Australia's leading Asia-focused youth dialogues to explore the role of youth in maintaining Australia's connection with our region, despite the many barriers facing us as a result of COVID-19. Before we begin, Asia Society acknowledges that today we are all dialing in from locations that have traditional owners and custodians. I myself am currently on Ngunnawal land. I'd like to therefore take a moment to acknowledge all traditional owners and custodians of the land we are dialing in from today and pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging. I'd also like to welcome and acknowledge any Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander or First Nation people joining our webcast today. Before we kick off, some brief housekeeping. This event will run for precisely 1 hour. We will begin with some welcoming remarks from our 2 special guests, and then we will begin our panel discussion. This will run for 25 minutes with 15 to 20 minutes at the end for audience Q&A. Please submit your questions at any time for this via the Q&A Zoom function. You can also vote on your favourite questions as well. So it is my great pleasure to now introduce 2 leading figures in Australia's regional engagement to officially launch this forum. From Asia Society, we are delighted to welcome the Honourable Kevin Rudd AC, former Australian Prime Minister and President of Asia Society's Policy Institute. Following Kevin's remarks, we will then hear from Senator the Honourable Penny Wong, Leader of the Opposition in the Senate and Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs. On behalf of Asia Society and all of us here today, thank you both so much for showing your support for this forum and for making the time to be with us. On that note, I'd like to hand over to you, Kevin.
Good, thank you, Mercedes. Good to be with all of our team from the Asia Society, including Philip Ivanov, as well as my genuine friend, you don't often say that in politics, and colleague Penny Wong. In my judgment, probably the smartest person in the Australian Parliament. So, and we're pleased to have her with us today. I think, Mercedes, I've got about 5 minutes or so, is that right? Okay, so brevity is next to godliness, so I'll try very hard. So we're looking at the central question of youth and the COVID reality in Australia's international relations, focusing particularly on our region. Let me make a couple of remarks about youth engagement absent COVID, and then a concluding observation about the COVID curse and how we turn the curse into an opportunity. On youth engagement in general, here are just some observations. I don't intend to tell war stories in terms of people I met 30 years ago who subsequently ended up as cabinet ministers and prime ministers or central committee members. I'm happy to do that on another occasion. But they do point to a common principle, which is in our Australian engagements with young people right across our wider region, friendships really matter. They really do matter over time. And friendships not in the who have I got in my contact directory, or who have I got in my, what we used to call in the Mesolithic period, our Philodex. It's people that you have chosen to get to know and to sustain a relationship with them and their families over time. That's really important, because across the multiple cultures that make up our wider region, either Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, or South Asia, if I can identify a number of cultural commonalities, it is this. One, these cultures value respect, and that is respect which we reflect towards them. 2, they value an equality in the relationship, which often, in the experience of many of these countries, has not been the case with their previous colonial masters, where whiteys have a particular reputation. And as a major whitey in this particular gathering, I can say that comfortably. Many whiteys, either American or European, don't understand the impact of colonialism on the proud countries and cultures which make up the vast Asian landmass and archipelagic Asia. But it's steeped in experience. So friendship, which is real, based on respect, based on equality, but also here's the real thing in this new age of the nanobite. It's based on consistency and depth, and that is being a consistent friend with people over time. And guess what? In all your careers, it won't be all wonderful linear trajectory in an ever-rising career path to universal success in everything you seek to do. You're going to run into a few brick walls yourselves. Never been my experience, never been Penny's experience. It was a joke, by the way. But guess what? Shit happens. But shit happens in everyone's career, including our friends in the region. And so sticking with people through thick and thin, through the hard times and the good times as they evolve over time, really matters. So why do I spend so much time emphasising something which seems so basic? Is that as a former foreign minister, as a prime minister, as a professional diplomat by training, and someone who's spent a lot of their life living and working in cultures both in Europe and in Asia, you'll be surprised how very few people do that. How very few people do that, particularly when it's the extra hurdle of being cross-cultural or transcultural. So I really emphasise the importance of friendship. The second overall point I'd like to make, and this comes particularly from an Australian perspective, is what I describe as the wisdom of smallness. Now, what do we mean by that? Or what do I mean by that? The thing about the Euros and the Americans is that they stumble onto the stage and either for reasons of past grandeur or current perceived, self-perceived grandeur, they see themselves as the large, big kids on the block. That reality is rapidly fading. But the good thing for us is it's never been the case. We've never really been the big kids on the block as far as the countries of and cultures of Asia are concerned. And so having about us an appropriate level of cultural modesty is actually very useful, important, and natural. We're not there as collective emissaries on the part of the American alliance. We're not there as collective emissaries on the part of wider Western civilization. As I said in an address to the African Union one day when I was campaigning for votes for the UN Security Council, which we successfully obtained, I began my speech by saying, "G'day, my name's Kevin, I'm from Australia. I'm not an American, I'm not a European, I'm just an Australian." And they all stood up and applauded, and we got 50 out of 51 votes in the African Union. I'm sure, Penny, there were other factors at play in that other than the fine nature of my own oratory. But there's a principle alive in the story, which is there is a wisdom and understanding, our own, as it were, middle power status in the region and the world. And we come to the table, therefore, as an equal co-contributor, rather than representing something much grander. So having about us an attitude of appropriate cultural modesty is really important. Final point, Mercedes, you'll be pleased to know I'll end on this, is an attitude or a posture of cultural modesty, however, should always be tempered by a self-confidence in who we are as Australians. The values of this country, whatever we may disagree with the current government or not, the values of this country are good values, okay? Decent values of fairness, decent values of equality, decent values of intrinsic human dignity, etc. And do you know something? When you're dealing with other cultures, particularly dealing with young people from China who come from a one-party state, never apologise for the fact that we come from democratic culture. Never apologise for it. We are who we are. In my engagements as Prime Minister of the Chinese political leaders, I always used to begin by saying, we're a liberal democracy, we believe in universal human rights. I know you don't like that, but guess what? That's just who we are. That's our identity. So there's a way in which that can be done, which is not sort of a general fist in the face, but which is appropriately confident in the traditions of freedom from which we come. The footnote now, Mercedes, on the COVID reality. None of us know. Penny may have this on a national security basis only, and she can exclusively leak this to you in her presentation. But none of us know when this virus is going to go away. And none of us know when there's going to be a vaccine. None of us know it's going to be an effective vaccine, let alone one that's universally deployed with 7 billion doses. Think about that. If you're the logistics operator for the Global Alliance on Vaccines and Immunisation at present, how the hell do you do that? So this reality that we're engaged in at the moment shouldn't be regarded as just a temporary curse. I just see it as part of a new and unfolding and textured reality. And this will mutate, that is Zooming and the rest, will mutate into different forms of social engagement. So use it, explore it, innovate with it, have fun with it, and ride with it. And don't just see it as a temporary inconvenience, because God knows how long this curse is going to be with us. Enough from me, Mercedes, and I'm looking forward to hearing from Penny.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And again, thank you for making the time to be with us today. Senator Wong, can I hand over to you for some opening remarks?
Thank you very much, Mercedes. And it's a real privilege to follow Kevin, who has changed the course of the nation in so many ways as Prime Minister. We opened with an acknowledgement of country and, of course, reconciliation, and the apology was such a huge step for the nation taken under his leadership. I was just going to start with an anecdote about Kevin that is relevant to today's discussion about Asia capability, and that is my father, who is now finally in his 70s, migrated to Australia, but for all of his life, other than being a Colombo Plan scholar in Australia, lived in East Malaysia, knew Kevin before I did, because he knew about the Mandarin-speaking new member of the House of Representatives who was elected in 1998, and he raised Kevin with me, in fact, before I was even in the Parliament. But it does tell us something about the region, and tells us something about the way in which the willingness of non-Asian Australians to try and gain an Asian language is such a powerful statement, and was such a powerful statement with Kevin as Prime Minister. I wanted to talk briefly. I'll just give a bit of an overview. I think that was those were my marching orders. So thank you, Mercedes. Thank you, Philippe. Thank you to the Asian Society for giving me that opportunity, and thank you to all of you for joining me today. So first, I wanted to just have a very brief summary of how I think the pandemic has impacted on our foreign policy and strategic settings. We know, and we've spoken about the extent to which the world was disrupted prior to the arrival of COVID-19. But of course, since the pandemic has hit us, that has worsened. And so in summary, we have really the biggest global crisis since World War II, the greatest economic downturn since the Great Depression. We have rising nationalism. We've got escalating competition between the great powers and fraying multilateralism. So it's a fairly challenging time. I think what it means for Australia and for our region is that we face a much less stable, much more divided and much riskier world. So we are, as Australians, going to have to work harder to secure our interests. I've said we have to be more self-reliant and more ambitious. We have to work much harder to shape the world and the region that we want, which is one that not only respects sovereignty, but is also stable and prosperous. Now, what is, in terms of the role of young people and how the pandemic is affecting the younger Australians or younger people around the world, I just want to make a couple of points about that. First, whilst we know that the virus doesn't discriminate, whilst we know that this is a public health issue for all generations, we do know that whilst young people may not make up the highest number of cases, it is that your generation which will be paying the price for the pandemic for decades to come. I think the World Bank has estimated $10 trillion in lost income over people's lifetimes without determined and coordinated action from government. And unlike the period of the GFC when Kevin was Prime Minister and led with others at the G20 a coordinated multilateral response, we haven't had that sort of multilateral response coordinated in the face of the pandemic or the economic uncertainty. In Australia, we've seen the pandemic disrupting educational opportunities, and that's obviously been particularly damaging for our higher education sector, both in terms of people coming here, but also Australian students wishing to study offshore. I hope that what this forum will generate is a discussion about how your generation can be at the forefront of new ways of doing business in this world. As Kevin pointed out, we are in a new world, and where we were is not going to come back. I mean, I think this pandemic is fundamentally reshaping how we are, who we are, how we operate internationally and domestically. And I think it's critically important as part of that the people who are on this call and more generally are at the forefront of working out what are the opportunities of that new world. I did want to make a point briefly about the levers of foreign policy that I think we need to be utilising in the context of a much less benign, much riskier strategic environment. There's a lot of discussion in Australia around strategic and military commentary. There's a lot of focus on military capability. We all would recognise the importance of enhanced defence capability. But I would make the point that our region and our prosperity and stability is going to be shaped not only by military capability, but also by the movement of capital, trade and people, by the strength of political systems, and of course the aspiration of the region's citizens. Our stability, our health recovery and our economic recovery is intrinsically tied to the economic and health recoveries of our region. And that's why those other elements of our foreign policy and our engagement, whether it's people to people, effective diplomacy, soft power, economic engagement, are central to achieving our shared objectives for the region. I've been critical of the government on this front on a number of fronts, but the most critical of which is the continued cuts to development assistance, probably the illogic of which was most demonstrated by an 80% reduction in support for health programs in Indonesia prior to the pandemic, which in hindsight looks as bad as it sounds. In addition, of course, I think our lack of leadership on climate undermines our leadership position in the region and more broadly. So where do we go from here? What do we need to do? I think I'd posit a few priorities. One, I think we need to collectively be at the forefront of protecting, galvanising, renewing and reforming multilateralism. We have to be at the forefront of galvanising response for our region. We know that Indonesia and many of the nations of Southeast Asia are facing prolonged economic and health crises. Whilst we may not be able to fix all that, surely we can be part of galvanising a more coherent response. I think we need to work not just with allies, of course, with allies, but beyond, with aligned nations, both in our region and more broadly around our shared interests. I think we need to build more credibility in the region. Climate change is part of that, but so is economic recovery. And I want to make a point about Australian identity, and Kevin referenced that in his opening remarks. I think a key part of projecting who we are in the world is making sure we articulate and project a much more representative national identity, one that has the history and the experiences of our First Nations people at its core, one that recognises and honours the place and contribution of our multicultural communities and our migrant communities, and one that more accurately represents our place in the Indo-Pacific region and in Asia. We also, and I don't think I need to say this to the people here, we also need to recognise we live in a time where nationalism is rising, both in Australia and across the world. So we have, as leaders in our, whether in politics or in our communities, we have to work to counter the nationalist articulation, the nationalist ideas, some of the nationalist tendencies in our domestic politics. In terms of how we talk with our region, the way I've described it is our influence is most enhanced when we move from them to us. And if we could move from them to us in how we think about and how we communicate with our region, I think that would be a profoundly powerful way of thinking about who we are and our place in the region. We need a renewed commitment to Asia capability. Kevin talked about this for a very long time when he was in Parliament and actually did something about it. We've obviously seen real problems with this government. The Australian Consortium of in-country Indonesian Studies, I never know how to pronounce the acronym, CCs, or which is obviously struggling given the border closures. We need more broadly, I think, to focus on not just Asian language, but Asian literacy and Asia capability. We need a much more serious plan for economic diversification, including in our region, and we need a soft power strategy that in particular reflects the identity that I've described. Now, all of this is going to be even more challenging given where we are. As I said, the world we had is no longer with us. And it is being reshaped fundamentally, both in terms of how we engage with others and also how we operate domestically. But as we all know, in those times of change, there are also opportunities. And so I'd really encourage all of you to think laterally and innovatively about how it is that we can do that work of being international citizens, of being Australians speaking to the world and here in Australia about the world and the importance of our place in the world in a time where we are both cut off in terms of borders, more distant, and where we are facing such political trends against collaboration, against multilateralism, and in support of nationalism. And I think you are a critical part of that process. So I appreciate very much the opportunity to be here at the opening of the discussion, and I really want to thank all of you for the work you do and will do at a time where those who care about our place in the world, our place in our region, and the sort of world and region we live in, I think your voices are needed even more strongly. Thank you.
Thank you, Penny, and thank you, Kevin. I think you have both just brilliantly articulated why the work of our panelists is so important as we navigate the very challenging strategic changes that are happening in our region in a post-COVID world. So I think without further ado, I will hand over to our fantastic panelists. We have 4 incredible emerging leaders with us today. Joining us, we have from the Australia-China Youth Dialogue, we have Board Director Cindy Gottinger. We have Founding Director of the Australia-Japan Youth Dialogue, David Lang. The Digital Events Manager at the ASEAN-Australia Strategic Youth Partnership, Jessie Nguyen, and Steering Committee Member and 2020 Delegate of the Australia-India Youth Dialogue, Bodean Hedwards. I encourage you all to read their full and very impressive bios on the Asia Society website, and I believe they will also be posted in the Zoom chat box. But to get started, David, we are in a period of very significant flux and disruption, as Kevin and Penny have both just outlined, and that was certainly true even before COVID. So I think my first question to you is, what are some of the key changes we are seeing in our region and how are they impacting geopolitics?
Well, thanks, Mercedes, and thanks to the team at the Asia Society Australia for bringing us all together today. Yes, absolutely, there's plenty of disruption going around in the Indo-Pacific. Strategic competition has been intensifying over recent years. Mainly, that's a symptom of a shifting strategic balance between the US and China. And it should also be said that the US-China relationship is in a pretty dark place today, and I think that's unlikely to change until after the election in November. At the same time, as Senator Wong went through, multilateral bodies are increasingly struggling to make an impact. Nationalism continues to rise. Militaries across the region are modernising faster than I think we expected 5 years ago. And we're seeing a much tougher game playing out in the cyber domain, from misinformation to fragmentation of the internet to the politics of TikTok and WeChat. So there's a lot going on. On how it impacts geopolitics, I think the COVID-19 pandemic will most likely accelerate a lot of these trends. Rather than slow us down, we'll be pushed faster into a sharper and more contested region. Less stability means less trust, which I think means that countries will try to take things into their own hands a little bit more and build some self-reliance, some risk management strategies. And that might be through developing new capabilities, as we're currently seeing, or finding common purpose with others in the region on certain issues. I think the real question for a country like Australia and for others in the region is whether we can move quickly enough or work creatively enough now that the future, which we thought was a decade away, is suddenly on our doorstep.
Thank you, Dave. Cindy, what do you think that some of the impacts of this new reality are for young people in Asia and Australia?
Yeah, thanks, Mercedes. That's a great question. I guess the overarching theme that comes to mind in terms of the impact is, I guess, people-to-people connections. The ability to travel, study, and work abroad, as Kevin and Penny both alluded to, fosters mutual understanding and exchange. And as someone who has lived and worked in China for 8 years, there's really something serendipitous about in-person, in-country interaction that is really difficult, I guess, to replicate today in the digital world. I guess the new reality has also represented an opportunity for us to think more creatively, for ways for us to foster people-to-people connection, especially when we can't even be in the same physical space. I guess in the short term, young people will need to think about how to adapt. And I feel like this generation is incredibly good at adapting, whether it be in the transition of technology or financial crisis and economic downturn. But I also think in the medium and long term, it's an opportunity to really rethink what this new reality means for them and for us. Just an example, I guess online education has seen a quick pivot, with regards to students not being able to go to school. I guess the question is, in the longer term, what does that mean for education? Is this a hybrid model that we can rethink, or is in-person education still the only solution? And just a little bit when it comes to ACYD, the Australia-China Youth Dialogue, for the longest time, we've had alumni based in Australia, China, and different countries around the world. And we've always been quite big on in-person connection, but this inability to travel has really forced us to rethink, amid the political tensions and uncertainty, how can we really still create a safe place for our alumni who have that established relationship to discuss, openly questions and challenges that may be top of mind for them. And so we've created a recent initiative called Alumni Circles, where we host once a month a closed door forum, not recorded, a really safe environment for thought leaders in our alumni base to share things that they may be working on, and also for our alumni community to ask questions. And it's really that connection and that ability through these trying times to have these conversations with people that you're familiar with, which I really think is something really encouraging that has come out of these challenging times.
Thanks, Cindy. It's really interesting to hear how ACYD is adapting to this changing landscape. And Bo, I'd be interested to hear how the Australia-India Youth Dialogue, which is similarly a very well-established dialogue, how you are adapting to the changing circumstances of 2020. Oh, sorry, Bo, I think we've got you on mute.
Thank you, Mercedes. And thanks everyone on the panel for being part of this really timely conversation. So, I mean, AIYD is the leading track 2 dialogue in the Australia-India relationship. We're in our 10th year this year, so there's already a lot of energy in amongst our alumni. But that was then emulated at the government level earlier this year with the virtual summit between Prime Ministers Modi and Morrison. So, I mean, what we've really been trying to do is to focus on how we capitalise on that energy. And we've spent the better part of this year so far really looking at how we do that. And we've launched our Alumni Enablement Initiative, which has really helped us pivot to ensure that our alumni across all different sectors are engaged in different types of initiatives. So there's different access points for them to be engaged in the conversation around what's happening in the bilateral, particularly because it's accelerated so quickly, where we've seen a lot of relationships stall a little bit. The Australia-India relationship has accelerated quite quickly this year. So since the beginning of the year, we have launched our Spotlight series with leading experts across sectors to talk about how the pandemic has impacted that sector. And then part of that, or kind of behind the scenes, we've been preparing our post-COVID recovery strategy and the rapid response grant program. Now, these two work together. The recovery strategy is based on extensive consultations with our alumni, our partners, and importantly, emerging leaders through the New Colombo Plan. It's really just an opportunity for us to map out those really tangible opportunities for alumni and young people, more broadly in the Australia-India bilateral, over the next 12 months and then sort of 3 to 5 years, about what they can do to contribute directly to the recovery efforts. But then to mobilise those ideas, we are launching the Rapid Response Grant, which will just provide some seed funding to kickstart either new initiatives or scale existing responses that are going to have a direct impact on the issues that were created by the pandemic. So, I mean, this entire period has actually allowed AIYD, and I'm sure a lot of them, to play to our strengths. We have an alumni of over 250 leaders across sectors, and they've all been impacted in really different ways. So while we might not be able to host the in-person dialogue right now, we have been focused on ensuring that those people-to-people connections and engagement really continues in an action-oriented, really solution-focused way.
Wow, well, it certainly seems like there's quite a lot going on both in the relationship and with the dialogue, so well done. It's a huge amount of work that's obviously going on, and I'm very excited to see how all of that goes. Perhaps I can ask Jessie, with the ASEAN-Australia Strategic Youth Partnership as a fairly young and new dialogue, having only started in 2019, how are you adapting to these changing circumstances, and has it been easy to pivot your operations online?
Yeah, I think both yes and no. So while ASIP's only been around for a little while, we are working, I guess, a little bit differently from the other dialogues that have been represented today, in that we're multilateral, so ASEAN as a collective of many countries. And our team has always been really creative and resourceful, but I think COVID-19's really encouraged us to embrace the innovative approach that we've all been talking about, especially in our programming. So in postponing our flagship event, which is an in-person forum, a conference, we've been able to really experiment and create more opportunities for inclusion because we're less constrained by physical space and budgets. Some of these include our regular digital events that I've been leading, the upcoming Innovation Challenge, ASIP Reset, which we're launching next week in partnership with the Australia-ASEAN Council, developing an online resource hub, and exploring some digital dialogues like the Indo-Pacific Student Mobility Dialogue in collaboration with other youth organisations. I think another advantage is that young people are generally well acquainted with digital platforms, and so our forum last year that I mentioned was organised almost entirely online. Our team was scattered across the region, and we've really been able to pivot in that way quite easily. Another thing that we've been thinking about more is how to be strategic about our partnerships and revenue diversification. I think some of our traditional avenues, like corporate and university sponsorship, are somewhat less viable in these circumstances. So we know that this is something we would have had to think about eventually, but I think the COVID situation has kind of expedited that conversation within ASIP about our sustainability and really forced us to think about how to build upon our existing relationships and reach out to new organisations. An example is we've been deepening our relationship with the ASEAN Secretariat, and this has enabled us to be invited a couple of weeks ago to the expert group on the development of the ASEAN Work Plan on Youth for the next 4 years, which is super exciting because Australia traditionally has never been represented in on a platform like that.
Congratulations. It's really fantastic to see all the work that ASIP has done and achieved in such a short amount of time, particularly for such an important relationship like the Australia-ASEAN relationship. I'd like to now turn to the importance of continued support for youth, multilateral and bilateral efforts in the long-term diplomatic relationships between Australia and Asia. And Bo, perhaps I can ask you, how does your organisation contribute to the Australia-India bilateral relationship?
Absolutely, thanks Mercedes. I mean, India, like a lot of the countries that are represented here, it's a relationship economy. And at the heart of kind of what the AIYD really does is to create those people-to-people relationships that ultimately are going to carry forward that really the broader strategic objectives of the bilateral relationship. So the AIYD's role in doing that was recognised by the Australian government's India and Economic Strategy by Peter Varghese. And we've, that's how we kind of see what we do, and that's part of why we've been trying to engage our alumni in this way over the last little while. Our steering committee is entirely volunteer run, so we run on the enthusiasm and passion that we all have for this relationship. But the dialogue is ultimately at the centre of this. Each year we bring 15 young people from different sectors to come together in either India or Australia. This year it was in India, to think through some of those really contemporary challenges, but also the opportunities in the bilateral. A part of this, for example, is the group challenge, where we put people from different backgrounds to come together, and they ultimately have to come up with an idea about how they could contribute as a group to the Australia-India relationship. But because we've been going for 10 years now, we've also been able to leverage the incredible wealth and knowledge and expertise from across the alumni group to inform important conversations between the two countries. We're doing this currently through the Spotlight series, which is being able to have that conversation virtually, but previously we've been able to compile submissions to government inquiries about key sectors in the relationship. So we kind of see our role as quite important in continuing those conversations.
Absolutely. And Cindy, perhaps I can throw to you, how important do you see the work of ACYD in the Australia-China relationship, and what impact do you have or that you're seeking to have in that relationship?
I think the objective of the four organisations in this panel is very similar, and obviously it's to foster mutual understanding and exchange, and the relationship that is formed at this early age is really fundamental to, and will serve itself in years to come as we individually grow and rise in our professional careers. And since 2010, ACYD has brought together 300 of the best and brightest young minds to engage in meaningful dialogues about issues pertinent to the Australia-China relationship. And our alumni have gone on to be active and visible constructive figures in the Australia-China affairs, and they promote awareness and mutual understanding of culture and society in the public interest. And it's really encouraging and inspiring to kind of think back to where our alumni are from 10 years ago or 8 years ago, when they're quite senior in their career, and how they're contributing to the Australia-China relationship today. And take, for example, our 2013 alumna, Alexander Fallon. She's an assistant professor at Georgetown University, the Centre for Global Health, Science and Security. And in her role, she's been involved in the COVID response in Australia, or across Australia, China, and the US. And she's currently working on China's national health law with teams at Tsinghua University in the US. It's really encouraging, and our effort at ACYD is to continue to share and showcase these stories, to provide a platform for the new generation to really kind of see that path potentially ahead for them if they so choose to engage.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Cindy. Jessie, you are still at university and you are also a former New Colombo Plan scholar. I'd be interested in hearing your views about ASIP and other initiatives such as the New Colombo Plan and their role in encouraging more young Australians to engage with Asia through their studies and time at university.
Definitely. I think youth-led dialogues and organisations like ASIP and so many others, and all of those government-supported programs like the NCP, hold such a critical role in encouraging young Australians to engage with Asia. It's so important, as lots of my fellow panellists and Kevin Rudd and Senator Wong have already mentioned, that young Australians really learn about our bilateral and multilateral relationships and the people, culture and languages that are across the region. I think for me personally, being involved in these initiatives have given me opportunities to develop leadership and cross-cultural communication skills and building those people-to-people relationships. But also, I think it's also prompted me to reflect on my own Vietnamese heritage. I think I hadn't really considered how I might be able to leverage my unique perspectives and experiences as an Asian Australian to help bridge these connections and develop these people-to-people links. So I think in that way, these programs are so important, and it's really encouraging to see the interest and the kind of broader society support for youth initiatives as well as these government programs. Unfortunately, my program is on suspension. I had to return earlier this year, so I am back home now, but as soon as we're able to travel and move again, I'm sure many of us will be really keen to get back out into Asia and restarting those relationships that we've already started building.
Absolutely. I imagine there'll be a huge influx of young Australians into the Asia region as soon as we are safely able to. Dave, sorry, we haven't heard from you for a little while, but with the next question, perhaps you would be able to share your thoughts on how important the role of young people more broadly are for Australia's long-term diplomatic relationships with Asia.
Yeah, sure. Mercedes, it won't surprise you to know, but I think that young people play a crucial role. I think by virtue of their age and where they're at in their careers and their lives, they are really the future. They come at problems often from different perspectives. We need a lot of innovative policy thinking. We need to think about old problems in new ways. And because they see the world in different ways, through different eyes, I think that some issues like climate change loom a lot larger. Often these youth dialogues, I think they can look like they're all about the immediate rather than the long term. Yes, it's certainly true that when we get our delegates together, we load them up with new knowledge and help them understand new angles of the relationships today. But the other element, the long-term element, is really all about relationships between our delegates. And Kevin's spoken about that. I'm sure there's plenty of people on this call who've been to a conference or an event, and it wasn't so much what they learnt at that event that was the most valuable takeaway. It wasn't what was said on the panel, it was who they sat next to or who they met at the lunch break and how they grew that into something new professionally. And we see that with the AJYD. We're already seeing these organic links developing. Alumni are bringing each other into their workplaces, supporting each other for events, but even in a personal sense, in an informal sense, we're seeing them through the last few months particularly reach out and support each other, help them out through this time where many people's lives have been turned upside down and they suddenly need new jobs or they need to get back home. So that's been really, really great to see, and I think it really just underlines that for the AJYD and for others on this call, relationships are really the name of the game. It's really why we do what we do. In 20 years' time, we like to think that our alumni will have developed in their careers and still be in touch with each other. And so if if sun is shining, they can make hay, they can take advantage of those opportunities. In times that perhaps aren't so rosy, these relationships could also provide some degree of stability, I think. So there's great value for Australia's diplomatic relationships. It comes down to building that pipeline of young Australian talent and giving them those opportunities to connect with their peers in Asia. We're doing that. We heard from Jessie that NCP is doing that. It's all about making that investment today, I think, because it comes back down the line.
Thanks, Dave. Absolutely. Now, I'm very conscious of time. So just to wrap up the panel discussion before we move to Q&A, I'd like to quickly turn to each of our panelists and ask if you could answer in just, a very brief 1 or 2 sentences. What is the ultimate end game or goal for your organisation or initiative? And what support would you like to see from government and the greater community to achieve this, or for youth-led initiatives more generally? Perhaps we can start with Cindy.
So I guess the end goal for us is to really continue doing what we've been doing, which is to foster, engagement across, Asia and Australia. And one of the challenges we've been facing is we're a volunteer-run organisation, and young, busy, high-achieving professionals also have a day job, and so a lot of the time has come to think about how we can operationalise our business, go support our fundraising to be able to continue to do what we do. So I think, the biggest ask is, I guess, a bit more stability in terms of the partnership we have, whether it be with government or with the private sector, because sometimes going year in, year out, trying to do the same thing can be particularly challenging. And I think a 3 to 5 year partnership would be really beneficial for us.
Thanks, Cindy. How about you, Bo?
Absolutely. So our end game has a few elements, but ultimately we want to continue to deliver the dialogue. It's been recognised by both governments as an incredibly important part of the broader bilateral relationship. But we also want to move a bit beyond this now, and we're positioning ourselves to support stronger business ties by acting as a bit of a platform between the two countries and offering this network to both support to provide access to existing market opportunities through our alumni, and really mobilise the power that sits within our alumni cohort. But our call to action, again, very similar to what Cindy mentioned, is the stability in funding will help, again, a volunteer-run steering committee do more and help us mobilise the vision that we have for AIYD, but also just more broadly to both governments. We want to see a permanent structure in place for genuine and authentic consultation with young people. We've already spoken about the issues that are going to impact us, things like education, science and technology, climate change. These are all going to be issues that will be handed to us as young people. They're being discussed, and we just want to be a part of that conversation about how we respond to that in the bilateral.
Thanks, Bo. And Jessie and Dave, both of you, very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for ASEP, it's all about sustainability. So we've expanded our team to more than 70 volunteers in the last few months, but we know that to succeed in the long term, we need to keep our team and our broader community engaged. So we are definitely going to be looking to some of the more established dialogues to learn from you guys about what you've been doing to keep your communities engaged. But in terms of just broader support, I think since we are so new, all we'd want is a chance to show both governments and business what young people are already doing, what we can do and what we're capable of achieving. So I guess our ask is simply that you keep watching this space.
And I think, Mercedes, for the AJYD, our priority really has to be on continuing to build up our alumni network, keeping them in touch with each other, celebrating their achievements, ensuring that they're coming together regularly to keep those relationships strong. So that's going to always be a priority for us. On what we want to see from government, I think there's probably, to build on what Bo and Cindy have said, probably an opportunity for government to help not just the AJYD, but other youth dialogues to mature their funding models. I know when we started the AJYD, there were dialogues with China, India, and Indonesia, which we took a lot of inspiration from. Since then, there are new dialogues with Vietnam, with ASEAN. I think there's a new one with Latin America as well. All of these initiatives are run by volunteers, all work very hard to bring in support, but I think attracting recurring investment is a challenge at the best of times, let alone in a global pandemic. So it's potentially an opportunity for government to earmark some money for the 8 major youth-focused dialogues. One model would be, I guess, to announce $25,000 a year for 5 years across 8 organisations. That's $1 million all up. Pretty simple, reasonably cheap, and it would provide a degree of funding certainty for these initiatives so that we can all make sure we're standing on the other side of this pandemic, which is crucial. But also it's something that would be a strong statement from the Australian government about how they value our work. It opens doors for us. I'm sure others will agree that when you can say the Australian government's on board, people take you a lot more seriously, and suddenly you can get investment from foreign governments. So I think, you know, there's a bigger role for the Australian government to play, and putting some money aside is maybe one idea that can let us all focus more on how we build and grow these initiatives and less on how we're going to pay the bills.
Thanks, David. And I did notice that some of the questions that have been coming through on the Q&A chat box have focused around financial resources in an increasingly difficult environment. So thank you for touching on that. I know it's a challenge for everybody, for Young Australians in International Affairs as well, even though we aren't a bilateral or multilateral dialogue. Thank you to all of our panelists. That was a fantastic discussion, and I'm conscious that we are almost at 4 o'clock when we were originally going to wrap up, but I've been told that we can finish at 4:10. So I encourage all the participants that are on the call to stick around. We will answer a few very short questions and then wrap up for a vote of thanks from Asia Society's CEO. So for the first question for the panel, one question from Judy was how to keep our courage in continuing youth relations despite our current reality. And I think that's quite pertinent to a number of the dialogues that we've got on the panel today. So perhaps, Cindy, I could start with yourself. Sorry, Cindy, I think we've got you on mute, but perhaps we can go to Jessie in the meantime.
Yeah, I think, again, like it's all about the people and the volunteers and the team. And I think the energy from the team of volunteers is so inspiring. I think working with people who are really passionate about ensuring the sustainability and the long-term success of the relationship is so important. So I would encourage anyone who is watching and is interested in collaborating or working with any of our youth organisations and dialogues to just reach out to us. I know for ASIP, something we've been doing is we've realised a lot of people are on LinkedIn by email. So we've kind of just skipped a little bit of the formalities that we're used to and just kind of reaching out to people directly to see whether they'd be interested in what we're doing. And we've had a bit of success with that. So I'd really encourage you to get involved despite the current reality.
Thanks, Jessie. Cindy.
There we go. Same question?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, similar to Jessie, I think for me personally, it's really been about the people. And I think just this exchange and this ability to kind of talk to people and actually have some practicality behind it. Sometimes when you read the news or you're in university and you're kind of taking in all this theory, for me, the turning point was really just that people to people connection. And we use that term so often, but it is so simple, as Kevin mentioned, but also so true. I think the people that stand by my side today are the ones that I've met 10 years ago when I first started working with the Australia-China Youth Dialogue. So I think surrounding yourself by people that share common interests, that are curious, that are open-minded, and very empathetic to sort of what's happening, and they're interested in Australia and Asia and the stability of our region, I think you can never go wrong when you do that.
No, you can't. The next question is from Lisa, and it's about how can the collective youth initiatives ensure resources and knowledge forums and shared and do not overlap, which I think is actually quite a really, really good question. Bo, did you want to have a go at answering that?
Sure. I mean, I think this program today, this webinar today, is probably the first step towards that. I mean, we all have different, each bilateral has their own unique perspective and different objectives and aims, but getting young people together into a room, be it virtual or otherwise, to have this conversation, I think is a really, really important first step.
Fantastic. Yeah, I don't think anyone would disagree with that. I've got a question that is directed to David, and it's about the relationship between Japan and its proximity to China and Russia, but also with the United States. And how do you see Japan responding to these circumstances, and how can Australians with experience in Japan adapt to this new world?
That's a big question.
It's a big question, yeah.
I think that Japan, like Australia, is trying to thread the needle. We've got a range of parties we need to engage with, and it's not always going to be the simplest policy sum to do. But I think Australians can probably help Japan by engaging Japan. We've had a terrific period since 2012 with Prime Minister Abe leading Japan. He's very externally focused, very motivated to have Japan as a force in the region, upholding a rules-based liberal order. That's been terrific for Australia, and I think that as Prime Minister Abe comes to the end of his term next year, that Australia should really be ramping up the engagement to make sure that we are in lockstep with the new Japanese leader. Abe-san has met 5 or 6 Australian Prime Ministers in his time. We need to be there to deepen that relationship right from day one, to make sure that as we go through the next few years, that we have a really strong personal bond that we can lean on.
Thanks, Dave. Look, we are almost out of time, and I'm very conscious that there are quite a lot of questions that got posed that we won't have time to answer. But I would just like to reiterate that Asia Society is very keen to continue today's conversation. So there will certainly be opportunities to engage with our panelists and their work moving forward. So watch this space. And if you'd like to learn more or get involved with any of the dialogues represented here today, please get in contact with our panelists. I think Asia Society is posting their details, so you'll be able to reach out. I have to say that I, for one, am feeling very energised by all the momentum and passion that young Australians have for building meaningful and closer ties with our region, and the innovative ways that everyone is adapting to this new normal that is 2020. That brings us to the end of today's forum. To close today's session, I'd like to now pass over to Philip Ivanov, CEO of Asia Society Australia, to thank our speakers and panellists.
Oh, thanks very much. Fascinating discussion. I feel energized as well. I'm not even young. I'm not going to try to summarize it, but for me, I guess the main takeaways are that this pandemic is a long-term structural change. So we all need to reinvent in how we work and how we engage with the region. The pandemic has accelerated many trends that existed before, and both good ones and bad ones, be it a geopolitical contest or digital connectivity, protectionism, or greater awareness of environmental degradation. Now, innovation will be the key to maintaining our connections with Asia, whether it's using Zoom or other platforms, or making limited funding work smarter, or doing things together like we did today. And finally, which I think is the main point, all of you continue to be as committed to international affairs and to Asia engagement as you were before the pandemic, which I think is the most important and highly positive point. So I want to thank all the panelists and of course all the organizations that you represent. Thank you for doing such a great work. I'd like to thank our speakers, Honorable Kevin Rudd and Senator Penny Wong. And also I'd like to alert you of the Mitch Fifield, our current ambassador to the United Nations, has recorded a message to all the participants, which you can view online. I'd like to thank our team and especially Eloise Dolan for coming up with an idea for this event and making it happen and seem so effortless. I want to thank all of you, our participants, for joining this important conversation, which I promise will continue. And you are ultimately the solution, but what we as a leading global and national organization can do is to help facilitate, convene, and support you as much as we can in this fairly difficult climate. Look out for 3 essays from our Generation Asia members coming out shortly on these topics as we continue this conversation. And most importantly, stay safe and stay in touch. Thank you, and until next time.